But yeah, because I find these ideas are quite complicated, and you can keep going back to them and seeing new things in them. And so I'm going to repeat some of the ideas about critical realism from last time. But
do you mind just opening the handle? Yeah.
But this time, instead of relating it to childhood generally, we're thinking more about rights, and towards the end, citizenship. And by the way, has anybody particularly come for citizenship? One. A few people. I'm really, on the whole, going to be talking about human rights, children's rights. We'll do citizenship towards the end, in case you're waiting for it to appear. Right. So, as I said last time, critical realism is a philosophy of natural and social sciences. It's not a kind of sociology. It certainly doesn't want to take over the social sciences. It wants to be a toolkit for researchers. And the aim is to clarify uncertainties and contradictions, and to connect opposing theories and methods so that our research can be stronger, more valid, more relevant, and easier, I hope you'll find, to link into policy and practice. Now, do children's rights really exist? When you look at this filming of the bombing in Syria, did the children living there have any rights at all? Are rights just meaningless in those kind of contexts? Have any of you been to Gresham College, right near here? It's been going for about 450 years, and you meet in this Tudor room for free lectures. And last week, Professor Lord Plant was lecturing on the liberal society and religion, and he declared children cannot be citizens with rights because they cannot make rational choices. They can be adherents to religious faith only indirectly through their parents' religion. So now we know. Also, maybe you've come across Professor Baroness Honora O'Neill, who is the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, so she should know about this. She's an expert on trust. And she said, I would trust some people to care for a young child, but not to post an important letter. Now, does that mean that it's more complicated to post a letter than care for a child? Or that a letter is more precious than a child? In either case, it looks as if children don't get much of a look in the Equality and Human Rights Commission today. Nobody, by the way, challenged Lord Plant on his statement. So, critical realism is about reality, begging the question, are rights real? Are they only ideas, hopes, words? Do they only exist in laws and conventions and guidance, books, journals, meetings, spoken claims? Are rights only achieved through discussion and negotiation and rewriting codes? There are conflicts, of course, between rights. For instance, the right to freedom of speech, but not to be racist. Between my rights to certain freedoms, but I must not harm any of you. So that individual versus collective rights can come into conflict. And also, are these conflicts only resolved in discussion, law, philosophy, logic, reason? In critical realism terms, are rights only about epistemology, thinking, discussion, or do they really exist through being and doing? Now, this is called the epistemic fallacy, when people collapse real things, I'm going to argue rights are real things, into words and ideas. When real children are collapsed into cohorts or childhood. And real things become abstract ideas, simply words, claims, constructions. Now, there's a dual recognition and separation of intransitive being, rights as constant realities, and transitive perceptions and thinking. What it means here is that we must separate you people really sitting here on chairs in the Institute, in London, in the world, and my ideas of you, my perceptions of you, looking at you as an audience rather than all the other roles that you occupy through your days. And instead of thinking that my perception, my labelling, my summary about you is what matters, critical realism is about how you, individually and independently, matter through your existence before and after I meet you. And this is partly about the semiotic triangle, and a great deal of research and academia concentrates on the top two corners of the triangle, the signified, which is the idea of rights, and the signifier, the words we use to them, rights, guidance, conventions, freedoms, entitlements. And nearly all academia is really concerned with these two things. And a lot of energy is then put in by researchers to justifying their theoretical analysis, or their very careful data collection and their rigour with their data and their meticulous data organisation. This is nearly all the discussion in academia. And what gets left out is the referent, the real child, the real right to food, to be free from hunger, that reality of gnawing hunger, and actual food that you can handle and consume. So instead of relying for our validation on our research wholly on our reports and our analysis, we can also claim validity by saying we are reporting real events, people, things. I know it sounds a bit basic, but once you get the hang of the idea and start reading research reports, this is just so true and happening so often. Now, first of all, you might say empirical positive research is concerned about facts and realities. And in positivism, they might think rights to life, education, free speech are seen in these 7 ways. First of all, they're objective, self-evident facts. Rights, according to positivists, would be universal, independent of the social context. The right to free speech is the same anywhere in the world. Detached from observers and agents. Thirdly, there's a pristine agreed meaning. Everybody knows what free speech means, and that's the same. Whoever quotes or honours or violates rights, those rights stand intact. Rights have essential inherent qualities, standalone reality, and they have a stable, lasting, out there in the world, unchanged across time and space. So if you're in Africa, Australia, or here, the right to freedom of information is the same. Rights are general, replicable laws, and they are reliable predictions. If rights are being denied to somebody, we know the process of how they should be allowed to claim them and reclaim them. And finally, rights are evident cause-effects. We can use and claim rights to support effective policy making and problem solving. So, for example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva requires reports from governments all over the world every 5 years, and these reports point out where governments are observing children's rights, improving on how they observe them, and falling down in standards. And these are clear rules for action. Now, there's a rather one-way detached way of looking at things in positivism, rather detached, like putting something under a microscope. There it is, divorced of its social context, clear existence, and unaltered by the observer, who is not affected by that. But, as we all know, this is a rather extreme version of a great deal of social science. Most of the social science really funded here is cohorts, evidence-based. It takes this factual, precise, grounded approach to research. And yet rights are complicated, their meanings are contested, they're often contradictory, they're interpreted and practiced in different ways. The idea of respect takes very different versions. For example, in some cultures it's respectful to look somebody directly in the eye, and in some cultures that is rude and disrespectful, and you should, if you're a subordinate person, you should keep your eyes down. But that's interpreted by many teachers in this country as a rudeness instead of a politeness, so you can have real contradictions and difficulties with rights. They do vary across time and space, in history and across the continents, and they do have uneven effects and unpredictable results, so that when people ask for their rights, they might get something quite unexpected and different. Is all this complication proof that specific universal rights cannot possibly exist? And if you don't have universal rights, you don't have rights, because by definition rights are a general equal standard everywhere. Now this again rather falls into the epistemic fallacy, when complex living rights are collapsed into static definitions, articles of a universal convention. Now the other main approach to social research is, would anybody like to say, apart from the empirical positivist approach, the other main approach is interpretivist, yes, or hermeneutics. And the idea here of hermeneutics is that the adult says, oh, you're a little child, I'll look after you. And the child says, yes, I'm a little child, you can look after me. And it gets more and more protective or providing. Or the adult might say, well, you're quite a strong, tough child, you can get on and do this. And the child says, yes, I'll do this. And there can be a more resourceful, resilient, equal relationship set off that keeps reinforcing and extending itself. So this two-way interaction and change in hermeneutic dyads is really important for how we think about rights. And are we going to emphasise the protection rights for children, or the provision rights to them, or the so-called participation rights when children have freedoms and can take risks and make decisions? Now this interpretive approach sees rights as contingent, perceived and constructed through negotiated interaction. So there isn't a kind of standard way of providing freedom of information. There's all kinds of different ways. We worry about how much children should have the unprotected freedom to roam the internet, for example, and it sets up enormous debates about how far it's respectful, kind and right to allow children freedoms or to protect them. Another thing about the contingent rights is the right to freedom from, say, hunger takes very different forms in different countries around the world. Secondly, this approach sees rights as arising out of relationships and social context and local means, like the direct gaze example I gave. And the enormous difference between 4-year-olds in nurseries and preschool settings in this country, when they're really seen as quite vulnerable, helpless, dependent little beings, to research by Antonella in Venezia in Peru, where 4-year-olds whose mothers were street traders agreed with their mothers that they would learn more and earn more if they set up their own small businesses, and that's what they did. And they were, in order to be able to do that, they had to be treated by the people who came to buy things from them as, more or less, a quote, adult-type street trader, who wasn't going to be cheated or persuaded to give away things, but was respected and bargained with. So that our ideas of children's capacities and needs are enormously shaped by their everyday lives, their freedoms and their constrictions. Rights vary, and also our idea of the rights of a young street trader or a young preschool attender vary enormously. So 3, rights vary and depend on whoever observes, reports and exercises them. And 2 people reading the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child might come away with a very different view about its its pros and its cons, its risks and its benefits. Some might see it, many people in America, the United States for example, see the convention as outrageously anti-family, anti-parent, and are wholly opposed to it. Other people might see the UN Convention as too protective and too much emphasising children's rights rather than shared human rights. Lots to debate about that. So, in some ways, with all these debates, perhaps rights do not, number 4, have essential, inherent qualities. Perhaps rights exist in the mind of the observer. And if so, do they have no 5 stable, living reality, sort of out there in the world, so that wherever you meet them, they stand for something the same? Do they really change a great deal across time and space? Number 6, if they do, are there no general universal laws or truths that support replicable findings and predictable agency? So can we use rights to as claims to correct wrongs and injustices and expect the same results everywhere? And are we unable to support transferred meanings about rights cross-culturally? Can we not really make comparisons and generalisations between different cultures and countries? And does that mean that rights are not effective for policy making and problem solving? Instead, we have to respectfully attend to each local culture. Now, some people say that it's irrelevant and illogical for the UN or any one country, particularly Western countries, to judge any other country's violations or practices of children's rights. But that would mean, of course, that we cannot have universal rights and principles. Perhaps they don't really exist. They're a figment of Western hope. But again, this comes down to the epistemic fallacy. Real, as I will argue they are, complex living rights are collapsed into ideas of moral relativism, social contingency. Now, although it's interesting that around the world plenty of people claim, oh, these children and these women and these men aren't interested in rights, they don't want rights. But it does tend, the claims do tend to be made by people more elite, independent people who, I've never heard anybody say, I don't want rights. They might disclaim them on behalf of other people, but seldom on behalf of themselves. Also, the interpretationists, the extreme ones who say there are no constants anywhere, contradict themselves in practice, because if they write an email, they assume that somehow those actual typed words are going to arrive intact at any place in the world. So they do rely on universal constancies. They have to. We couldn't live for an hour in the day without assuming that when you put a kettle on to boil, it's going to boil, and all sorts of things like that. And to suspend this reliance on reality for ideas is a contradiction and an illogic. Two more big questions about rights are whether we tend in our hearts either to see the world in a functionalist way, that everything's like a beehive in society and everyone's working together for the common good and we're all in it together, and even if it's difficult for some, it's in their best interests overall. In this sort of view, children are sort of born pre-moral and have to be socialised into the right norms. Their deviancy must be corrected. So if society is working like a harmonious beehive, we don't need rights, because they would just disrupt the smooth working functioning system. On the other hand, another set of people in their hearts are critical theorists, in which they see life, society, more like the forest, where the trees are struggling and competing together for the scarce resources of water, space and light. And in those sort of visions of society. Rights are an essential way of arbitrating differences and working towards justice. Another thing about functionalism and critical theory is our view about intergenerational relationships and whether we feel that on the whole adults are benign and they know what is best and they provide for children and can be relied on to do that. Or you think that there's an increasing divide between older generations, which are absorbing a lot of the resources, power and control and are messing things up a lot, and the younger generations who are being deprived of income, hopes, opportunities, and actually finite natural resources in an alarming way. And for the second view, rights are also extremely important for having a balancing and a justice between the generations in the interest of all. Now, to think about the reality of anything, it's helpful to think about it on the 4 planes that we all live on, which I'd argue cover all aspects of our lives. Bodies in relation to nature, interpersonal relations, social structures, and our inner being. And I'm going to look at rights as real on all those 4 levels. By the way, please do join in and make comments and say if something isn't clear, or will you? And would anybody like to comment or disagree on anything I've said so far? I'm trying. Oh, good. Yes.
I think you might be about to come on to it anyway. But
Yeah.
what do you mean when you say rights are living? You say living rights. What do you mean?
Living in the sense. Thank you. Because I suppose 2 meanings. One is that we exercise rights in our daily lives. They come alive through in our bodies, our relationships and so on. I'll come on to that. But the other thing about rights is that they have an independent, in a way, life of their own. I'm going to argue that they do. Even in that bombed area of a city in Syria, there were the rights. And I'll go on about that a bit more later. Anyone else? Did somebody else say they'd like to say something? Oh, yes.
It appears to be a little bit off topic, but it comes back to kind of gratefulness to me, talking about the conflict between the rights, so the right to participation and the right to protection, for instance.
Yes.
So I do research with street children in Egypt, and I was out there doing an ethnography, observing the right to participation and how the children were part of the demonstrations and the protests. And then the research took a life of its own, changing from an ethnography to action research, creating a campaign, fighting for the protection of children during these demonstrations and protests, and taking them off the streets during times where it became extraordinarily violent. And when I came back, and it only occurred to me when I was coming back and looking at all this data that I was in fact prioritising which right the child had in this situation, to take part of this change, social and political change, or me thinking that no, actually their right to physical protection was more important.
Yes.
So it's reassuring to hear that.
Yes, and also very interesting to think, would it be different for children, younger children, for young people, or for adults? Would you want to protect adults to the same degree, or would you think, well, it is their decision?
Yeah.
Mm. Good, thank you. I hope your example resonates through the next parts. Anyone else? Yeah.
Again, we might come on to this in a minute, but
Yeah.
I'm looking at children and young people's participation in health and social care settings. I've been coming across quite a lot, this tension between participation rights and safeguarding, and I think, the situation that they were just talking about when children are perceived to be vulnerable and needing to be protected, and how some practitioners particularly seem to see that as a real kind of dichotomy, that it's, you're either at one end of the spectrum or the other, and you're either promoting rights or you're protecting people who are vulnerable. And I think it's quite interesting in terms of the kind of the social situations in which children and young people find themselves.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I think at heart, again, whether you're a critical realist or a functionalist, do you agree with me that people do tend to be one or the other, predominantly, would you say? And I think also adults at heart tend to be protectionists, like social workers, providers like teachers and so-called participation people like activists, agitators, risk takers. And again, like the critical theorists, I think the third group tend to be a minority of people. But what it means, I think, is that professions tend to be very much dominated by people with moral values shaped around one of those three very much, and they all reinforce one another as well.
I think it's interesting when you talk about protectionism, because I wonder who they're really protecting sometimes. And I wonder whether it really is about protecting a child's right, or whether, if you unpick it, actually it's about protecting their own position and power, or not wanting to take risks in case of uncertainties for their own roles, etc. So I think there's hidden meanings behind those things sometimes.
Definitely. And you could say that social workers actually take on one of the most risky jobs in society, because if something goes wrong, they are for the chop more than almost any other profession. But if they are very at heart protectionist people, there's a very interesting, brave contradiction going on between their taking risks with the child and with their careers and wanting to protect the child that's going on. It makes very interesting, complicated dynamic. Right, so I'm going to go through these 4 planes of social being, and the first one is bodies and nature. And I'm going to say that rights exist in our bodies, and I cannot think of a single right that isn't honoured or violated, confined or freed, starved or fed, stripped or clothed, tortured or rescued, degraded, humiliated, discriminated against, treated equally and justly, respected. None of these rights can happen except through our bodies. And even something as abstract as freedom of information and expression has to happen through our 5 senses of our bodies, doesn't it? So would you like to tell me any right you think is disembodied? Because often they're thought of as thoughts, aren't they, or legal concepts, rather than living, biological, in a sense, entities. Choice. Well, it has to be about a reality choice. It's never abstract, is it? Can you think of a disembodied choice that we might be able to make? Usually choice is a feeling, and of course emotions merge into hormonal feelings that our bodies experience and tell us about as well, aren't they? They're not, emotions are not abstract things either.
So, yeah, I was thinking of things like religious choice.
Religion. Now religion is so interesting because a lot of religion is ritual, and even things like trying to still and calm your body. Much of religion is about bodies, or it's about trying to escape from the body and despise it, but still the body is a fairly central entity. Yeah.
But if you're talking about emotion, does that not come under 4 inner being?
Yes, probably, yes.
Rather than 1?
Well, it does, but then emotions are embodied experiences, aren't they?
I suppose there's lots of feelings that you can get quite physical. Sometimes I'm thinking of anxiety, for example, can feel very physical, much an emotion, but it's also a kind of a physical reality at the same time, maybe.
I mean, very often emotions, you're not sure about them, and then you get a gut feeling or something which alerts you to, oh, I'm upset, I'm worried, oh, what am I worrying? And the thought perhaps follows the physical feeling.
But can it be separated from number 4, the inner being?
No, and also all the 4 planes are interacting as
Right.
well, and things come under more than one of them. I don't want to sort of divide them up too much. It's more, I suppose, I hope, useful to draw attention to these 4 that critical realism is trying to. So, now I think Lord Plant and Baroness O'Neill were both thinking that rights belong to the rational person, the adult, who has matured and earned rights to have rights, and they are head things. But another way of looking at rights is actually they are living, being and doing embodied things, and that brings down the age range of people who can understand, experience and exercise rights, down from the rational, disembodied adult. It's based on Kant's views about non-interference and privacy of the rational man, which people have criticised as being bloodless and disembodied. Now, of course, the other part of number one is the material natural world. And so many of our rights depend on the natural world. In fact, the wars in Syria and all those countries are in areas highly water stressed, food problems, great heat with use of air conditioning by people who can afford it, which increases the problems. So that you can really trace back wars to the natural world and fighting over it and our embodied needs. And also the coming crises that are predicted by climate change scientists about floods and droughts. The oil, land and water wars are just going to increase, it seems, and with a great deal of forced migration, because nearly all the great cities in the world are down at sea level, and if the oceans rise, there'll be massive forced migrations. A part of the problems are the loss of species and predators, hedgerows, which perform so many vital functions. The heritage that we are passing on to our next generations. Problems of food chains. For example, if bees become generally extinct, it's predicted we'll have 4 years left of food, and that will be that. The overfished oceans, the idea that the oceans are getting warmer and more acidic, which is destroying many species in the oceans, apart from stirring up tornadoes, storms, altering deep sea currents. We've been seeing it in the newspapers about Britain for the last few weeks, haven't we? And the doubt about how much all these different events can be traced back definitely to climate change, or that weather is enormously diverse weather around the world is one effect of a great broad general movement that goes backwards and forwards but is generally moving towards warming climate. And our dependence on the natural world reminds us that we're animals too, we're part of the natural world, not separate from it, and that our rights really depend on all the other species and the planet itself. And I know some people like talking about animal rights. I think that's a problem. I think rights are about human beings rather than other species, but we certainly have obligations to them. Does anybody want to put in a word for animal rights here? It certainly ups the rights of babies and little children if we think animals have rights, but I think animal rights is a very difficult concept.
Saying you have rights in certain circumstances, the ones that we chop off and eat don't have the same rights as the ones we keep as pets.
Yeah.
It's problematic.
Yes. And maybe our obligations to them are the more important thing to talk about than their claims. Yeah. However, when we're thinking about bodies and when we're thinking about the natural world, that is one way of thinking about the solid physical materiality of rights. Now the second level is our interpersonal relationships. And I'd argue that integral to any relationship are rights. Even if you're standing next to somebody on a crowded train, how they push against you or try to protect your space is a rights thing of respect in the end. Whether it's ever mentioned or explicit, there it is. And when people violate it, like women often say that they just feel disrespected, or old people feel written off, just by casual indifference and ignoring, in a way that comes down to a rights issue of respect and equality and justice. So that they are there, latently there, whether people are conscious or even mean to be disrespectful or respectful. It's something you can avoid. Again, would anybody like to tell me about an interaction that they don't think some kind of respect, equality, inequality comes into? I mean, I think when we phone call centres, I think the enormous pressure of having to wait for ages by the people who are organising the call centres and run these businesses is infringing on the rights of both the caller and the person in the call centre in a way that sets them against each other. This is getting difficult because a lot of people think rights are personal, public, formal relationships, and they shouldn't intrude into families and intimacy. And to say, oh, it's my rights for you to do the washing up tonight, isn't a helpful way of having discussions. But underlying this are ideas of respect, fairness, justice, and consent. Because if one person agrees they'll always do the washing up, they might be furious about it and resentful of it, or think, well, it's fair enough, it's in exchange for other things. So underlying it are kind of rights equations, I'd argue. Do you agree, or does it all sound a bit too mathematical and calculating? And you'd rather forget about it inside your own home, or not? You'd rather remember it.
Not necessarily. I guess what's jumped to mind isn't about necessarily about within a home environment, but within how some people will claim that someone else's just existence or expression of who they are is infringing on their rights. So, I mean, the most recent examples we've heard about are around religion and sexuality. So the right of gay people to marry is impacting on other people's rights to freedom of belief. Just by their being in existence is impacting on other people's rights to their beliefs. But perhaps the same level of analysis isn't always afforded the other way around. So there's some real competing and real kind of dynamics that come out in some of those relationships.
Definitely. And you could say that rights are not strictures and rigid laws, but they are the means to make explicit these differences and to negotiate them. So they're sort of tools and assistance rather than repressive commands. And people aren't always going to agree, are they, on it? And also they're all going to see things very differently. But again, that's about human interpersonal relationships and their very nature, and rights are just one way of trying to deal with some of the main problems. An imperfect way, there isn't a perfect way, is there? I mean, can you think of a better way to negotiate peaceful, just human relationships in the public world than rights? Of course, there are universal rules when I'm the emperor of the world, but apart from that kind of. I expect you're all thinking, well, rights are a very recent idea, and of course they are. But what I'm trying to just say really is that rights are a fairly modern language for describing something that has been going on ever since we had interpersonal relationships. We see them in different ways, and we describe and understand and interpret and enact them in different ways than we did 5,000 years ago, possibly, I don't know. Because you had Aristotle people talking about these very same things, although in different terms, because they thought that inequality between men and women, most people accepted that. But there was still this thing about justice, equality, respect that has been going on, and that the more elite people claimed for themselves. And that rights over the centuries has gradually included more and more and more people, women, ethnic minorities, disabled people, gay people, and finally, partly, children, into the enfranchised world of rights. And again, that comes back to the intransitive, basic, essential living rights, or sense of justice, entitlement, respect that's mutual, and the transitive ways that we describe it, perceive it, interpret it, behave about it, and enshrine it in conventions, which will change a bit. And it's those two things, one the constant enduring thing, and the other is the transient changing thing. But the transient changing doesn't mean that the constant enduring thing is also transient. They are two different things interacting. So Kant very helpfully identified the basic idea, the basic right, is really privacy in the sense of people not interfering with others, not pushing them around and making them do things they don't want to.
Our rights quite dependent on affluence. You know, in obviously in low-income countries, it's not going to be something perhaps people there are talking about as easily as more educated, affluent Westerners are.
That's a really good point. And first of all, our rights, do you mean they exist more with affluence?
We've got more capacity to think about those things and more awareness perhaps, because when people are kind of just coping with the very basic necessities of life.
Yes, so in a transient local way, we perceive, interpret, enact, respect and so on rights more fully perhaps. But you could also argue there that the intransitive basic rights are still latently there in all societies. And what's been very exciting in the last decade is the huge number of protests in many Eastern and Middle Eastern countries among people who it used to be said, oh, they're not interested in rights. Rights are a Western idea. And these protests seem to demonstrate that everyone in the world probably has yearnings for this and wants the language to express and claim it. Interpersonal relationships, critical realism distinguishes between power one, which is the creative, emancipating power, and power two, which is repressive, coercive power. And it's really useful to have two different terms for these entirely opposite ideas, instead of just using the vague word power, which can be very confusing. And really, rights are about working from power two towards power one. Hegel talked about master-slave relations, and at first I wasn't all that keen on using it, but I'm getting more keen on master-slave relations, because really it means that the master in some ways dominates the other person and takes things from the other persons without their consent, by force or subtly, and it builds up anger and resentment, or sort of martyrdom as well, which isn't all that helpful, rather than equality. One argument is that master-slave relations, the archetype for that is the adult-child relation. I'm going to boss you about for your own good. And it's a question about how much this prototype adult-child relation of domination and control is actually necessary or helpful, and that when adults and children work on a more even level, taking risks and making demands of each other, that is a more kind of healthy and fully human way and power one way to live. I mean, do you want to give any examples, and do you want to disagree with that? It can be awfully difficult, but then what happens is that children are so used to being in this, quote, slave position. I know they have absorbed lots of resources and have lots of treats, and people run around looking after them a lot, but they are still not in the master position. Ultimately, the adults can say, stop, that's enough, I've had it. And a great deal of our relationships are sort of infantilizing children, making them more kiddie than they need to be. Or do you agree? Or yeah.
Can I just say that what you're saying reminds me of all the horror films, that the most horrific films are always with a child who has power. isn't it? So like that's kind of interesting.
But they're made by adults, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the most
Well,
horrific idea is for a child to be in that.
Yes.
Just,
And the masters make horrifying stories about the slaves' rebellion and end of the world, and the slaves should be thankful for being slaves.
But as a mother, when I had younger children, there were times when I pulled rank in that way.
Well, you have to. One is traffic and streets, isn't it? And there are all sorts of really complicated things in children's lives in this country that, for instance, there are the streets lined with takeaways and sweet shops and everything. Life is extremely difficult, isn't it? But then you could say the masters there are the giant global corporations that are running the policy, the food policies, and the planning and all sorts of things that make life extremely difficult for people to have ordinary.
Also the power that happens before, when there are babies, like female genital mutilation and circumcision, where children have no choice, never, and it's accepted, and has been accepted.
Yes.
Centuries here as well.
Yes, and in a way that's not just interpersonal. The parents, it's social structures, traditions, fears, religion, all sorts of things are making our lives constrained, aren't they? But yes.
Sometimes even deciding what the child's best interest is without going to the child and investigating more about it and just making that decision for them as adults.
Yes.
I think could be seen as a master-slave relation.
Yes. And the other thing is that life isn't perfect, so you've got the choice of your children going to a school where they're quite unhappy and it's not very efficient, or nothing much else, and to think, well, part of living is putting up with things and coping with them and not being ground down by them too much, not always being rescued from them. Again, it comes back to the conflicts of different kinds of rights and balancing and negotiating them. But at least rights give you the language and the ideas to think about these different options. You could argue that the right to protest and dissent is a universal desire to work from oppressive power two to emancipatory power one. And that children, would you argue that they really are the last non-emancipated group left? All adults have been emancipated, at least in theory and law. Only children are left. Yeah.
I think it's interesting when I think a lot about lots of research that's going on around resilience, because there's a whole kind of field of research about
Yes.
children and resilience and what characteristics, whether resilience is innate.
Yes.
And it strikes me that actually an awful lot of that is to do with that shift from power 2 to power 1.
And
Kind of
the
enabling
inner
resilience.
urge for
Yeah.
it. Yes.
I think there's also, I think people with disabilities
That's what I was saying.
Adults as well, and children as well.
Both.
Yeah.
Just as a group.
And older demented people, and yes, there are all sorts of groups, but in some ways in a law court, on the whole, adults are taken to be competent unless it's proven otherwise, whereas children tend to be taken to be incompetent, untrustworthy, unreliable, not really too sure, unless they can prove otherwise.
But in terms of mental illness, there is still that difficulty that some in court wouldn't be taken. I mean, up until recently, was it that if you had a major psychiatric incident, you weren't able to be an MP or something? There was something in law that changed last year, so there is still some of that within mental health issues.
There is, and this raises the enormously complicated question about human rights and what being human means, and how, if you do lose, how much of your mind you lose before you don't count as an average human citizen. So the idea of the rational person is at the heart of rights in a way. It's just that it needs to be expanded out beyond pure disembodied reason, and it's also about respecting people who might make seemingly quite crazy decisions. For example, look at the sports people in the snowy Olympics. I mean, are they sensible or not? Luckily, they've got the right to go and do that and be admired. And there are all sorts of alternative ways of behaving, which rights give some protection and allowance for people to do. Now, when the idea of art is the yearning for rights universal art, this seems to be a really good example of people from all sorts of different cultures who do want certain rights to integrity and respect. I think Michael Gove's agreed to Need Farmer, hasn't he? Has he? Have you read about the story in the newspapers, everybody?
So, sorry,
Yeah.
what do you think about that, about cultural rights? What is your opinion?
But I think if rights were really Western, then you wouldn't get lots of with Muslim women and girls claiming. Now, of course, she has grown up in this country, and you could say, is she Western or not? But it's certainly, there are protests around the world in many different countries about this, aren't there?
Well, if I would like to share something with you, and I would like to quote somebody. It's not my personal opinion, but I must say that I quite agree with her. It's from Aleki Marangopoulos. She's working on human rights, Marangopoulos, and actually what she said is that maybe we should revisit cultural rights, because even here in the West, before we before we take a certain stand on human rights, we were somewhere else. We were burning people on the name of Christianity. It was our culture. So maybe human rights, even in these cultures, should be prioritized over their cultural rights. I mean, should these girls be mutilated on the name of their culture?
Well, human rights would say no. But I hope I have.
Shouldn't these girls or these people get to know education? I think most of them are not really educated overall.
Yes, but also the point that she's making is that the schools and the police in this country should be taking far more serious measures to protect and prevent this from happening.
Schools and?
The schools, because of so many girls going back to Asian countries during the school holidays, and that the schools should be educating them all about the dangers of that, and then following up any girls who have had female genital mutilation and taking action about it. But I hope I'm not implying that our country is a really rights-respecting country and has been in the past, because it definitely is not, is it?
I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
And also, is it not arrogant?
No, and yet thousands of girls are thought to have had the here and be going abroad and coming back. Things just aren't being done. So
But then what about our arrogance saying that cultural practice in that country is completely wrong? If that's something that at a very deep level they feel that just said beautifies them, whatever, then that's quite a big thing for us to say. Obviously that's completely wrong.
It's difficult about physical integrity and girls who are too young to consent as well. I'm a bit worried I've put that up now, and what I should have done is put up a very modestly dressed Muslim girl next to a bikini-clad Western girl and said, whose rights? Because you could say that there are huge oppressions on girls in many countries to dress skimpily and look sexy and glamorous, and is that kindness to them? So I'll alter the slides to be a bit fairer. I was really admiring her, but I can see that it's a complicated
And it's
message.
also a big focus on girls as well. It's about boys in other cultures and other traditions.
Yes, that they've got to be macho. Or, yes.
Yes. Yeah, so
Yes.
this is-
Yes.
and nobody touches that.
No. Now the third one is the social structures and the history, and again looking at whether there's this inner human impasse. The exodus of the Israelites from Egypt thousands of years ago is one example of this search for freedom and walking for 40 years or so through the desert looking for the promised land, and the way that that worked as in so many ways for the civil rights movement centuries later in the United States with, do you know the Negro spiritualists? Because when Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go, and the great slogan and the fights and the protests and the language that that ancient story gave to modern protests. And through England, I'd argue that really rights started in protests, and then they got refined by the lawyers and the philosophers and the politicians into a language. But there was this intransitive resistance. And before the Magna Carta, there was the Charter of the Forest and people's rights to feed their animals in the woods and collect fuel and hunt for animals. And when the Normans came over here, they stopped all that and persecuted the poor people for using the forest as a source for them, for their livelihoods. I expect you know all these other periods in history. And Thomas Paine, who, do you know about Thomas Paine, everybody? He was a customs officer in Britain, and in those days, anyone who offended the state, if they had the death penalty, which wasn't that uncommon, they were hung on a tree in the village or town, and their body was just left to rot as a lesson. And he was so enraged about this that he went to America, and he wrote 2 great documents on rights. He advised on the American independence movement, and then he went to France and advised them on theirs as well. Do you know about the Burston School strike? It's the longest strike that there's ever been in Britain. And what happened was that in a village school, 2 of the teachers lit a fire to help the children dry up their clothes. They'd been walking for 3 miles in the rain. And the school governors, and particularly the local vicar, were furious, and they sacked the teachers so that the children walked round marching and protesting and waving flags, led by Violet, aged 14. And then they set up another school on the village green. And they had huge support from the trade unions and working class people around the country, and they built a new school. And when it was opened 3 years later, Violet said, "With joy and thankfulness, I declare this school to be open to be forever a school of freedom." And she chose the word freedom of all the things that that school stood for. And the school lasted right through till 39, and when one of the teachers died. So another thing is, it's not often known that before Martin Luther King became active, the real beginning of the United States civil rights was black students refusing to be served in the blacks-only canteen at school and going and sitting in the white canteen. That was the first definitive movement. And I expect you all know about the school children in Soweto, and it's thought they were so angry that their school would have to use Afrikaans, thank you, yeah. They'd have to be taught in Afrikaans. They had this great protest, and nobody knows how many children died then, but that seemed to be the spark in the beginning of the anti-apartheid movement? No.
No,
It-
one of them, yes, one of them definitely.
Okay.
But it was going before then.
I wanted to make the point though that this protest isn't just an adult thing, that people of really young age want to get involved with it, especially when it directly affects them through their experience. And then there've been the recent Arab protests. So, apart from these actual physical embodied protests of masses of bodies on the streets fighting, which you can't get much more nature than that, rights exist in social structures and philosophy. And I've just put a list of philosophers who discuss rights in different ways, evolving towards ideas of justice and equality between all people. Oh, that's interesting. It's hot. We've been going for an hour, and I just wonder, would you like to have a 10-minute break, and then we'll carry on? Okay? Yeah.